Okay, thanks for joining me again. And we're making progress in this final perek of Masechet Sukkah, perek Hecholil, which is about the flautists and the musicians who accompanied the ceremony of the Simchas Beit HaShoeva during Sukkot, and more generally, actually, the role of the musicians during the Avodah ceremony in the Beis Hamikdash, during the Karbonot as well, the Tomid Ben Harabaim, Tomid Shal Shachris, the two daily offerings, which were accompanied by song from the Levium, and they were accompanied by musicians as well. So we were in this inyan, and we will start on the very top of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph 51a. Actually, the very first word at the top couldn't be any easier to locate than that, Ketanai. Just before we do, let's just do a little bit of a reminder. We are going to go back on a bit that we did towards the end of last week's Shir, but nevertheless, in order to go forward, we always have to go backwards. We know when we're learning Gemara, in order to set the groundwork for the discussion that is about to come. So the brisa that we quoted discussed the flautists and their music, and there was a machloket there in the brisa between two sets of Tanoim. The first opinion, that of most of the Chachamim, said that the flute, the playing of a flute to accompany the Karbonos, was not Derech Shabbos. On a Shabbat, it wouldn't have been used. They wouldn't have used these flautists because they were playing musical instruments, and there's always a risk that the instrument will break down. And if it breaks down, it might be repaired. If it's going to be repaired, somebody may be Machalel Shabbat on the repair job. So therefore, it was not Derech Shabbat and Yom Tov, which means that the Korban Tomid, we're not talking here about the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, but the daily Tomid offerings in the morning and the evening, they would be accompanied by song, but not necessarily by the flute musicians. The flute musicians would have days off then, and they wouldn't be involved. That was the Chachamim, they were Machmir. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, he held differently. He held that the flute is doche, Shabbos and Yom Tov, but it was used all the time, irrespective of whether it was a weekday or whether it was a Shabbat or Yom Tov, it was used, the flute was used. Why was that? So the Gemara suggested, and this is really the topic that we've been going in and out of, that this machlokas on whether the flute instruments were used on Shabbos and Yom Tov in the Beis HaMikdash to accompany the Levium in their song is based upon a fundamental disagreement between the two sides, on either side of the argument. On the one hand, one set of Chachamim believe that Ikar Shira Bepeh, that when the Torah mandates that there should be music accompanying the Korbanos, it mandates it really only for vocal song, which, as you understand, is the Levium singing. So they used to sing in their choir, and that is really the Shira that is required to accompany the Korbanos. The fact that there was additional instrumentation, like the flutes, well, that wasn't within the mandate of the Torah. So it was just there to help make the occasion more musical. On that basis, the flutes wouldn't be allowed to be used on a Shabbat or a Yom Tov, because since the flutes were only part of this, if you like, a subsidiary accompaniment, but the main song is from the Levium, only the Torah part of the Shira would be used on Shabbos and Yom Tov, which is the singing itself, but the instrumentation wouldn't accompany them because it wasn't part of the mandate. It was just part of like a Hidu mitzvah to enhance the mitzvah. Whereas there is another opinion that says Ikar Shira B'Kli, that when the Torah mandates music to accompany Korbanos, it's really mandating the instrumentation, and the voices, the vocals of the Levium are only subsidiary to help the instrumentation. If you take that point of view, that since the instrumentation is really what the Torah mandates, then you will be allowed to use the flutes even on Shabbat, because the Torah says you should, because that is the very nature of what is required. So this is the basis of the machlokas on whether flutes were used on Shabbos and Yom Tov. The question revolves around whether we say ikashira b'fer or ikashira b'kli. Does the Torah's mandate for musical accompaniment really apply only to the singing, the Levim, and not the instrumentation? Or does it apply really to the instrumentation and not the singing? If you look in the Chumash, it's not clear at all exactly where there should be musical accompaniment. Some of these are psukim, which Chazal use to interpret. So therefore, when you look at the Torah doesn't say the Levim would sing. And we may have various songs to that effect. And in Tehillim, you see that they were musicians. But it doesn't actually say whether they were vocalists or whether they were instrumentalists. And that's why it leaves room for this fundamental machlokus. Now, the Gemara is at the beginning of this Amud, Nun Aleph 51a, going to prove that there is such a fundamental machlokus. The Gemara has speculated that this is what lies behind the difference of opinion as to whether flutes were used on Shabbat and Yom Tov, that what lies behind that difference of opinion is whether you hold ikashir b'kli or b'fer. And the Gemara is going to try and prove it now by reading this machlokus into a different discussion between Tanoim on the who were the personalities who were playing the music in the Beis Hamikdash. And here we brought this interesting brisa, which seems semi-historic. So we go to the top of 51a, Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, Ketanoi. The Gemara says that this whole question of ikashir b'fer or b'kli, which is the real mandated form of music, is it instrumentation or is it vocalist, also underlies the next machlokus that we'll see. We're going to be bringing a three-way machlokus, three different opinions. And the Gemara is going to say these opinions actually relate to the question of whether the music that was required is instrumental or whether it's really vocal. Okay. Ketanoi, de Tanya. We have the following brisa, so it could be a Mishnah according to a different girsa, but makes no difference to us for the purposes of understanding the logic. Avdei Kohanim hoyu. It starts in the middle of nowhere, really, but the context is that this brisa is talking about the instrumentalists who made the music, the instrumentalists, not the vocalists, the instrumentalists who made the music at the time of the Korban Tamid. As I said, the Korban Tamid was accompanied by the Levium singing and instrumentalists. So there's a question of who these instrumentalists were, and there was this machlokus as to whether it was Doche Shabbat, the instrumentalists were Doche Shabbat, whether they could also play their musical instruments on Shabbos. Over here, we're going to be looking at the personalities themselves. Who were the instrumentalists? Can you give them names and addresses? And the Gemara does that. The Brisa actually tells us who these instrumentalists were, in a manner of speaking. So it says the Brisa, Avdei Kohanim hoyu. That's the first opinion, Divri Rabbi Meir. I'll show this onto you on the screen in a moment, so we will be able to revise these three different opinions. The first opinion, that of Rabbi Meir, says they were Avdei Kohanim hoyu. They were actually quite low-class individuals. The Kohanim would find themselves avadim, slaves or servants, and they could even be non-Jewish, according to this view, who just happened to be excellent instrumentalists, right? They would go out into the instrumentalist marketplace, audition a few, and if some of them were good musicians, they would employ them and set them up essentially as instrumentalists to accompany the playing of the playing of the music for the Karbonot and to accompany the Levim in song. Now that wouldn't be kosher because the place they stood right at the side was a place where you didn't have to be a Kohen to be in order to become a musician for the avodah service. You didn't have to be a korban. It wasn't in the chotzer, which was only delimited for Kohanim. So that's the first opinion. They could be anyone. They could be at the lowest class of individual. Their only qualification need to be that they were good musicians. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Next opinion, Rabbi Yossi Omar. Rabbi Yossi actually gives us some more detail. He says, not at all. They couldn't be Avdei Kohanim. They never were Avdei Kohanim. They had to be a little bit more miyuchostic than this. They had to have more of a status. They had to be Jewish, and they had to be good Jews. This is what he says. Mishpachas Beis HaPekorim, umishpachas beis Tzipporah ume emos hayu. They were from either the families of Beis HaPekorim, which could be an area or a location, or the household name, or from the family of Beis Tzipporah. We don't really know who these families were. Ume Emos hayu, and they came from this place called Emmaus, which is mentioned in the Talmud and other places. It's just outside Jerusalem on Kvish Echad, somewhere along the Kvish Echad area. And that's where they came from. Shahayu Masian lekahuna. They were of such yichus, they could marry their daughters over to Kohanim. It's just a way of expressing that they were a high level. They weren't just Yisraelim who were sort of working in the fields. No one knew where they came from. People knew what their families were. They came from good pedigrees. As a result, their Kohanim would even take their daughters as wives. A Kohen doesn't have to marry a Kohenes, but he would normally be very particular because he was a Kohen. He might be a little bit more careful about the yichus of the wife he took. And these families were always of such high standing that they were fit for Kohanim. So according to Rabbi Yossi, they were certainly not Avodim. They were not Leviim, but they were amongst the creme de la creme, if you like, of Yisraelim. And they were the ones who were playing the music to accompany the service of the Korban Tamid. And now we have the third opinion. Rabbi Chanina ben Antignas Omer. So Rabbi Chanina ben Antignas says, Leviim hayu. They were actually Levites. So the same way as the singers themselves were Leviim, and the Leviim had a function in the Beis HaMikdash. It was the Leviim who also were the instrumentalists. I mean, therefore, you had a smaller marketplace. You think about it. If you're looking for the best musicians and you had to take them out of the Leviim, well, you only had a marketplace of however many Leviim there were. If you could take them out of the whole Yisrael marketplace, well, there are another 10 tribes there, so you could probably have a bigger market to choose your musician from. If you could even take it from the Goyisha marketplace, the first opinion, the world's your oyster. You could travel to, Finland and find the best musician there, bring him as an Eved, and he would be able to play. That's just an aside over here. But it's interesting to see this tiering over here. One opinion that it could be almost anyone. Another opinion there had to be at least Yisraelim of good standing. And the third opinion, which is, if you like, the most elite, is they had to be Leviim. They had to be people who had a real function in the Beis HaMikdash. They weren't the Kohanim themselves. Kohanim would get busy in the Avodah itself, the ceremonial of the Korbanos, etc. But the Leviim were the ones who were ministering to many subsidiary tasks. And it was Leviim according to this third opinion. Let me just share my screen with you to revise these opinions. Okay, so I've written it this way. Who can be a flautist? So Rabbi Meir, who can be a flautist? I'm not talking about it in the sense of who can be a flautist, in the Jerusalem Symphony Orchestra, obviously. I'm talking about who could be a flautist to accompany the Avodah service for the Korban Tamid in the morning and the evening. Who could be a musician in the Beis HaMikdash? So according to Rabbi Meir, this first opinion, we have even Avodim, non-Jewish slaves, almost anyone who can hold a flute. According to Rabbi Yossi, it would have to be distinguished Yisraelim. They're the ones who came from Emmaus. And according to Rabbi Chanina, only Levites, only Leviim. Okay? So this is all to do with personalities. The Gemara is now going to take this back and show how those opinions tally with a question of whether it is the instrumentation which is really the mandated part of the music to accompany the Avodah and the Beis HaMikdash, or whether it's the vocalists. Who is really the one who the Torah requires to make music? Is it the singers or is it the musicians? How does that fit into these personalities? So here the Gemara has a go. We brought 3 opinions, and the Gemara is going to cheat in this next attempt. That cheat will be immediately noticed, and therefore this particular proof will be discounted. But let's go through it in order. The Gemara says, "My la b'ha kamifliki." Don't you think that the reason that we have this machlokus about who were the singers in the Beis Hamikdash, the flautist in the Beis Hamikdash, is precisely based upon our argument as to whether it is the shir, as it's the kli, the instruments, or whether it is the vocals, which is important. How come? According to the first opinion we mentioned of Rabbi Meir, who said that there could even be avodim, they could even be ordinary slaves and servants, they didn't have to be Jewish, they didn't have to be Leviim. Kosova, the reason he says that, they could be almost anyone, is because he holds Kosova, Ika, Shira, Bapeh. The Torah's mandated music is the vocals. If the Torah's mandated music is vocals, the instrumental accompaniment is just as by the side. It's just something to make it all a little bit nicer. That doesn't have to be done by Kohanim. It doesn't have to be done by Leviim. It doesn't have to be done by distinguished Israelim. You can get a slave or anyone else to do that because it's not a necessary part of the musical service. You can do without it. So the one who says that you can take anyone clearly must be of the opinion that Ikashira, the pair, the reason you can take anyone is because the instruments don't really count. You might enjoy listening to the instruments, but if they don't really count, you don't have to have anyone particularly noble, if you like, to play the instruments. So that'll explain him. And Uman da Omar, says the Gemara, Leviim hayu. The third opinion, we're missing the second opinion, the one who says that they were Leviim, this is the most elite interpretation, that even the instrumentalists were all Levites. That person holds Kosova Ika Shira Bakli. He holds that the Torah's mandated music is instrumentalists. Well, if the Torah's real mandated, the goal of music, according to the Torah, is instrumentation, then you've got to make sure that your instrumentalists are of the most, if you like, elite nature. Leviim, the Leviim who actually work in the Beis Hamikdash. So that very cleverly associates those two opinions with the question, those two opinions with the personalities we choose over here. If you say that it's only the instrumentation that really counts in the Torah's eyes, then you will go for the Leviim, being the instrumentalists. If you say that it is the vocals that the Torah considers to be the main music, then the instrumentalist could be anyone. And you would say that even avadim, even slaves, and even non-Jews would be fit to be the instrumentalists. So that very cleverly apportions the two of the three opinions here according to whether Ikashir B'Kli or Ikashir B'Fer. But now the Gemara catches on to this and says, it's a nice try, but I don't accept that we necessarily have to make that one-for-one correlation between the two sets of arguments. Says the Gemara now, but Tisbara, do you really think that you've answered the question that you brought, says the Gemara, so to speak, in response to this possibility that those two opinions about who they were tally with Ikashira B'Per and Ikashira B'Kli? Says the Gemara, doesn't really make sense because you've skipped the third opinion, the one in the middle. If you remember, the one in the middle, which is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, he says they were distinguished Yisraelim. Now, where does that fit into the argument of whether you are mandated to use instrumentation or vocals? It's somewhere in the middle. We had two opinions about whether music or vocals, instrumentation or vocals, were the main thing, and we associated them with the opinion as to whether the Leviim had to be the instrumentalists or even anyone can. But the one in the middle, over here, Rabbi Yossi says they had to be a distinguished Israeli family. Says the Gemara, how does that fit in? Which of those opinions are you going to ascribe? Does he hold that it is the instrumentation which is mandated, or that the singer that's mandated? This middle opinion is something which is very awkward to deal with, says the Gemara, and explains why. But Tisbara, Rabbi Yossi Maikosava, what are you going to suggest is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, who says they have to be distinguished Israelim? What is his opinion going to be? Is it musicians, or is it instrumentalists, or is it vocalists that the Torah requires? How do you fit him in? Which peg do you fit him into? He has to fall in with one of these two opinions. If he holds that the Torah really requires vocalists and everything else like music is unnecessary, afilu avodim nami. Why does he say that they had to be distinguished Yisraelim? He should agree with the first opinion. If you say that it's really only the vocalists that count, then surely the musicians could be from anyone. Why does he say they had to be distinguished? So it doesn't seem that he fits very well in with Ikasher Befer. If Rabbi Yossi holds Ikasher Bechli, that it's instrumentation, which is really what the Torah mandates, and not the singing, Levim in Yisraelim, no, then he should have required Levim. In other words, the Gemara is saying, really, you'd have brought me a good proof if there were only two opinions in this brisa, the opinion of Avdei Kohanim or Levim. Then you could say the Avdei Kohanim, the Avodim, fits with Ikashira Befer. The Levim fits in with the opinion Ikashira Bekli. But there's a third opinion in the middle, which is Nishtahina Nishtaher. That's what we find in practice over here. And that disturbs the logic, says the Gemara, to say that you associate Rabbi Meir with one opinion and Rabbi Hanina with another. You've got Rabbi Yossi in the middle, who doesn't fit into either of those opinions on Ikashir Befer or Ikashir Bekli. So the Gemara discounts necessarily that you can relate one argument to the other. Ella, says the Gemara, the Kula Alma, Ikashira Befer. The Gemara wants to make a different go with this time. The Gemara surmises over here at this moment, the Ikashira Befer, that really you could have used anyone. The Ikashir Befer means the main mandate of the Torah is to have Befer, the mouth, the vocalists. That is the music that the Torah requires. It is vocal music. If that's the case, then we come back again to saying that you could use a slave and you could use, it doesn't have to be a Levi, it doesn't even have to be Israel distinguished, and it can even be a slave. So why have you got these three different opinions? So listen to this, says the Gemara, Ubahaka mifligi, de masava hochi hava masa, or masava hochi hava masa. The argument between these three isn't of the question of whether Ikashir Befer or Ikashir Bekli. Everybody agrees, all these three agree, that Ikashir Befer, which means in theory, there would have been no halachic barrier for the flautists to have been avodim. So why have we got over here three opinions, one saying they were avodim, one saying they were distinguished Yisraelim, and one saying the Levim? You know why? Because this is what happened in practice. There's a machlokus on the historical facts. Those facts are not, sometimes there's just a machlokus on facts. It's not a machlokus necessarily, which reflects on an underlying opinion. In fact, in theory, an avod could have been used for all of these. However, according to Rabbi Meir, it was indeed avodim who were there and who were singing. According to Rabbi Yossi agrees that in theory, avodim could have been used, but he says in practice, in the Beis HaMikdash, they wanted to go one better than that, and they rather had distinguished Yisraelim. Not that they needed to, but I'm telling you what actually happened in practice. He says, my grandfather told me there were distinguished Yisraelim. Those were the people there because the Beis HaMikdash determined it was not going to go for them merely what they could do, but rather what they would like to do. So they made sure there would be at least some yichus amongst the flautists. And the opinion of Rabbi Hanina is that the Beis HaMikdash are even more makpid. Again, they could have gone for ordinary people, and they could have gone for avodim, but something about the management in the Beis HaMikdash said, you know what? We have Leviim, who are the main servants of the Kohanim, and they normally sing. We would like them also to be the flautists, even though in theory we could use slaves, because Ikashir Befer, the musicians, the instrumentalists really only playing an accompanying role, and it doesn't matter who they are. But in practice, we feel we should use the creme de la creme, and we should use the Leviim. And therefore, this machlokus between these three opinions as to who were the flautists is not based on whether you hold ikashir b'fer, ikashir b'kli. Everyone holds it's ikashir b'fer, according to this view now being expressed by the Gemara. And even an Eved would have been fine. The argument is on historical fact. That Rabbi Meir holds the historical fact was they installed Avdei Kohanim. Rabbi Yossi holds the historical fact is they installed as these musicians the distinguished Yisraelim. And Rabbi Hanina ben Antigonus holds that the historical fact is that they installed only a Nevi'im. So what you have over here is, again, we've moved away from the halachic argument. We find in a number of Masechtas, and indeed we've seen this before as well, that a lot of the Tanaitic discussion is post-destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So it's not as if they're staring at the Avodah service. They're 100 years after the Avodah service, or they're 50 years after, and they're relying on descriptions given to them by their parents, or maybe they were little children. And some of the facts of who did exactly what in the Beis HaMikdash were already fuzzy. And where there's fuzziness, you have room for disagreement in terms of different traditions that passed down about actually how the service in the Beis HaMikdash was conducted. So that's what we're saying over here, according to the way the Gemara sees it now. It's not a fundamental disagreement in principle. In principle, it seems that everyone's in agreement that an Eved could have been used because the instrumentation is not important. However, there is a disagreement as to what actually happened in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara asks something a bit strange. The Gemara now says, Lemay nafka mina. Why do we need to be told this? Lemay nafka mina means what difference in outcome is there? Whether we say, according to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, or Rabbi Hanina ben Antigonus, whether they were Avdei Kohanim, whether they were distinguished Yisraelim, or whether they were Leviim. That's the Gemara's kasha. Now, we have to understand what this kasha really means, because it's a bit peculiar. The Gemara's just got through answering. There was no particular reason why these three argued. It's just their parents told them different things. They were asked to express their opinion as to who were the flautists, and these three opinions came up on a historical fact, and they differed on historical facts. So what's the Gemara now saying? What's the outcome? What's the outcome normally means, where is the difference between those three opinions? Usually means that there's a halachic difference coming through over here. We've just got through saying there is no halachic difference. They all agree that ikashir b'fer, that really you could put an eved there. Everyone agrees in the halacha. They only disagree on history. So this question's a rather unusual question. When the Gemara says this is only a machlokas in history, and the Gemara says, for what reason? What do you mean, for what reason? If you think something's black, something else thinks something is red, no one will then say, for what reason do you think it's black? For what reason do you think it's red? So this is a peculiar question. This lamai nafka mina at this point is a peculiar question. But we will see now the Gemara answers it in a way that will make clear what really the question was. But what's really digging at the Gemara when it asks this question now is generally when you have a Mishnah and the Mishnah gives three different opinions, it's usually in order in order to establish guidance, or not necessarily establish guidance because we've got a machlokas over here, but in order to teach you that there are three potential differences that can emerge in practice from the three opinions, and merely to bring a machlokas which is based on historical fact. It's not sufficient to justify the Brisa. Yeah, the Brisa isn't a book of history. We're not talking here about Rabbi Beryl Wine talks about history in the Beis HaMikdash. Were they instrumentalists? Were they Bnei Leviim? Were they from distinguished Yisraelim? Were they Avdei Kohanim? This is not a history novel. So we don't need to know why there were three different opinions. In practice, we say they all held the same halachic view that it is the vocalists that the Torah wants are not necessarily musicians. So why is a brisa bothering to teach you a history lesson? That's really where the my nafkaminas come. It's interesting, but why do I need to be told it in a brisa? Yeah, put it into a history book if you like. Bring it out as a separate history series. But Mishnayos and brisa aren't necessarily there to do that. Now, I would say that that's not necessarily true. We find Mishnayos and Brisas that do get wrapped up a bit in history as well. But this is the question that the Gemara is asking my nafkamina. Why do I need to be brought a historical fact which tells me nothing more than history? So here, the Gemara says, well, it does, you know. It takes you further than history. So the Gemara says this, Lamalin niduchon leyuchasin ulamasa kamif lagi. Now, this is using a form of terminology that we find elsewhere in the Gemara. Literally translated means, in order to raise a person up from the platform into pedigree and into giving of masa, the tithe, they're arguing. Let me just do the words, and then we'll come back and explain what's going on over here. Manda amar avodim hayu. The first opinion that said that in practice, in historical fact, the musicians, the flautists, were even avodim, even non-Jewish slaves. He kosava, he would hold ein malin beduchen lo leyuchsin v'lo lemaisa, that you would not be able to deduce from a musician on the platform playing the flute. You wouldn't be able to deduce his yichus, or rather, you wouldn't be able to infer that he has a yichus. Neither would you be able to infer that he's a Levi in order to give him Maisa. Uman Da'ama, we'll go through these first, just translating. The other opinion who said Yisraelim Hayu, that they were these that they were Yisraelim, that they were distinguished Yisraelim. He holds that ein malin meduchan leyuchs Yisrael hayu kasava malin meduchan leyuchsin avolo lamasa. He would hold that by looking at the person playing the flute, you could deduce that he was meyuchastic, but you wouldn't necessarily give him maisa. You couldn't deduce he was a Levi. Uman to Amar Leviim hayu. The one who says historically the flautists were Leviim, Kosova, he must hold Malin miduchen bein leyuchsin bein lamasa. You could deduce from the fact that he was playing the flute that he was both niyuchastic, in other words, he had good status and pedigree as a Jew, and you could also deduce that he was a Levi, and you could give him the Levite tithe, Maisa. So what's going on over here? So let me just share my screen. It's interesting over here. In a sense, the Gemara is really saying, let's take the situation of an onlooker. This is the way it's easiest to understand what the Gemara is saying. You have an onlooker, and he's onlooking. Let's just imagine, let's go back to one of my lovely pictures, this beautiful picture over here. Remember that lovely picture I gave you? Oops, I may have overstepped the mark on this. You see here, maybe I. So here we have a korban tomid in the base Hamikdash. You have the Kohanim, you have the smoke going up, all very, very beautiful. And the Kohanim are all in their white robes. And on the sides here, on the duchen, on the platforms, are standing the Leviim who are singing, and we have the musicians. So we see them here as trumpeters maybe, but they may be flautists as well. Now imagine you're one of these people down here below. Let's say you're Israeli, it's not dressed as Kohanim, but you're witnessing this great event. It's, you know, it's a big thing. It's like Birchas Kohanim on the first day of Chol Hamoed Sukkos. Great throngs of people, there's music, you can smell the korbanos, you can see the smoke going up, and you look up at the musicians. Yes, you're looking up at these ranked musicians. You know why? Because you want one of these musicians maybe to be a chosen for your daughter. Your daughter's already a manageable age. And you're looking up there and you're wondering, and you spot just a particular musician there. Let me just cut this down again. You spotted a particular musician who you think is very handsome, he looks very noble, and you want to make a shidduch between that musician and your daughter. And you're a distinguished Israeli, say, but you want to make sure that you're picking up a musician where there's no pagam, there's no blemishes to his pedigree, and you're looking up at that rank. Now imagine you're in that situation. Then, if you held, I'll put it this way. Let's look first of all at the marriage, the yichus. The yichus refers to the marriage prospects of the person you see. The meiser that we mentioned before, that refers to the tithe you might give the individual. If you held that even avodim could be flautists, then what's the consequence? You would not allow marriage of a flautist to a distinguished woman. In other words, if you believed, like the first opinion, Rabbi Meir, they could even be avodim, then you would know that you couldn't look up and find the first handsome flautist on the stand and marry him to your daughter, because maybe he's an eved. In fact, he may very likely be an eved, not even Jewish. So you wouldn't even contemplate the thought of making a shidduch from the person up there. You, the observer, would not even contemplate that thought. On the other hand, if you held that only distinguished Israelim could be flautists, then you would allow marriage of a flautist to your daughter. Why? Because you would imagine that if he's up there and you can only have distinguished Israelim, that the Beis HaMikdash would have screened him and determined that he was a distinguished Israel, and you wouldn't have to make any further inquiries. You could straight away go up to him and say, can I offer your hand in marriage to my daughter? Knowing full well that he was a screened, fully viable yichustic Israeli. And if you held that only Levites could be flautists, then you would allow the marriage of this any flautist you went to your daughter, to any distinguished woman. No one has a problem with marrying a Levi to their daughter, imagine. I mean, that's even more creme de la creme than a distinguished Israeli. And you would even give Meiser to him. And you wouldn't have to make an inquiry. You wouldn't have to make any further inquiries. If you believe the historical facts, in other words, if you were looking up, and as far as you were concerned, the rule was that only Leviim were used for the services of the music, then you would be able to pick on any one of those musicians, and you could assume that he had been screened successfully by the Va'ad in the Beis HaMikdash as being a Levi, and you could bring your Meiser to him without any further question. Now, normally, there is a question, and we'll talk about this in a moment. Who is a kosher Jew? Who is a Levi? And as we'll see in a moment, who is a Cohen? How do we know who's who? Well, just because a person's name is Mr. Cohen, he's a Cohen. Just because he goes up to Duchen on a Shabbos morning in front of the Aron, you assume he's a Cohen? How can you make such a presumption? Because he gets called up as Levi and he washes the hands of a Cohen, you assume he's a Levi? Where do we get this from? He could be having us on. It could all be a joke. Over here, the Gemara is answering that question. The Gemara is saying, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, you would be able to determine the yichus of an individual based upon the role they played in the Beis HaMikdash. If you were an observer at the Beis HaMikdash, stop sharing a moment, and you saw a particular individual performing a korban ceremony, you could be sure he was a kosher Kohen and not just someone having you on, and you could give your trumas to him. If you saw someone performing a Levite function, then you knew that he had been screened and he was a kosher Levi. And according to the opinion that the musicians, the flautists, were Leviim, you could presume he was a kosher Levi and you could give your Meiser to him as well. If you believed that the flautists were goyim even, you wouldn't take another look at them over there for your daughter. So the Gemara says this essentially is the difference that comes out of these three opinions. It's not just a question of historical fact, but that historical fact had an impact. The impact being, what would you make of the individual up there? Would you make of him as being a genuine Levi, a genuine Yisrael, or might you even think he might just ordinarily be a goy? That would depend upon what the rules were at the time. And let me go back to that of Kohanim again, because the Gemara in a different Masechta brings a very, very parallel question of whether you're ma'ale mimizbeach leyuchsin, ma'ale mizbeach, etc., l'nesias kapayim. Essentially, how do we establish the credentials of a true Kohen? Now, you might say nowadays we do a DNA test on him. But even at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, this was already a problem during the second Beis HaMikdash. There would be people maybe who were, so to speak, dressed themselves up as Kohanim, coming from Kohanic families in order to get certain privileges. The privilege of getting, having the door opened for you, getting the first aliyah, particularly Trumas and the Matnos Kohuna at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. They would get a certain amount of free meat, etc. So there were certain privileges in being a Kohen, and if you could dress yourself up as one, then you would get those privileges. So for a time, it was necessary to try and screen, and there was no certainty. And the Gemara brings forth certain rules. The ones we brought here, for example, on the flautists, are an example of how you might be able to decide yichus based upon what you observed in the Beis HaMikdash. And as I said, the Gemara says when it comes to a Kohen and not a Levi, ein ma'alin mimizbeach yuchsin, which means that and ein bothkin, it says also l'ma'alin mimizbeach. In other words, you don't have to do any further investigations to determine that a person who is working on the mizbeach as a Kohen is a Kohen. That's all you need. You rely on the fact that the Beis HaMikdash has already done so. You don't need then to go into his family background to the chief rabbinate to determine whether they've given him Kohanic statement, etc., because he's been authorized, so to speak, by the Beis HaMikdash, and you can rely on that. Nowadays, this whole question arises in a very much stronger fashion because we don't even have the comfort of watching who goes up to the Beis HaMikdash to determine who is a Kohen nowadays. It doesn't matter about Levi so much. What is the Levi's privilege? He gets the second aliyah. He washes the hands of the Kohen. Some people don't think it's a privilege to have to finish your Amidah quickly in order to wash the hands of a Kohen. That's not a big deal. No one's going to pay highly for that. Being a Kohen even today means that you duchen, means you get the first aliyah. People ask you to bench. You get a certain amount of priority and covet. And therefore, there's a halakhic aspect there. The first aliyah, and particularly the duchening, going up to duchen and bless the Jewish people. What do we do in practice? We've got no Beis HaMikdash to tell us what this person's grandfather or great-grandfather was. We've lost contact with our yichus a long time ago. There's a few Jews in the world who say they know their Kohanim going back 2,000 years, but not too many of those. So in general, we rely on a certain chazakah. In other words, we say if the person's, sorry, I'm just going to stop that. If a person says that he's a Kohen, then we allow him to duchen, unless we know otherwise. We give him the first aliyah, even if he comes from overseas and we have no idea of his background. He says he's a Levi, we assume he's a Levi. There is a question whether, to what halakhic effect that really is, bisman hazeh. Does that mean we really believe he's a Kohen, if he says he's a Kohen? Or does it mean that we make believe that we believe? That's a little bit subtly different. We make believe we believe because we allow him to duchen. But do we really believe? And is there real nemonis? Halachically, there is a difference between those two. If we had trumas today, real truma in our Torah, we probably would not give it to a person we would allow to duchen. Because we sort of believe we believe, and we make believe we believe. We can't be sure about the yichus of a kohen bisman hazeh. It's interesting that, it comes through also in the nature of pidyon haben. There's a particular view anyway. When you look at the pidyon haben ceremony, which is one of the only actually ceremonies in which a Kohen is involved with other individuals. Other than the ritual in shul, what does a Kohen do nowadays, which is different to what a Levi Israel does? He is the Kohen who who sells you your firstborn back. Essentially, when the firstborn son, I'm talking about a human son, not talking about animals anymore here, it applies to animals as well, but Pidyon Aben, the Bechor of the family, essentially the father has to pay money over in order to be allowed his son back again, because really the Bechor is Kodesh to the Kahuna. He should essentially, in some way, belong to the Kohen, and he has to be brought back off him, according to the Torah. 5 shekolim of silver, that's an actual amount, and there are special shekels which are minted for this occasion, which are the right weight, and sometimes people have their own sets and they use them. Often it's the Kohen who has a set, because he does more than one of this, and he uses this set. And what does he do? If he's using his own set, he hands that over and gives it to the father of the son, who needs the pidyon, the pedia, he needs the redemption. And he gives it to that father as a complete gift. Now it belongs entirely, well, I think he really knows he's going to get it back again. He gives it over for the purposes of the occasion as a complete gift to the Israel, to the father. The father then goes through the ceremony, says, can I pay you these 5 shkolim in order to get my son back? And the Kohen usually says, okay. And he takes the 5 shkolim and he hands over the son. And now the son belongs again to the father. And in theory, if it belongs to the Kohen, those coins belong to the Kohen. Supposing that the father actually pays money for him, he can do, and it's a minhag to actually pay money, then he pays that money over to the Kohen in order, so to speak, to acquire that set of ornate 5 shkolim. He pays the son over. That sum may or may not be really the worth of 5 shkolim. It may only be a nominal amount. But in practice, very often, the Kohen gives it back again. Yeah, or if it's the amount of 5 shkolim, unless he's a very poor Kohen, he may give it back in. There's a minhag anyway for the Kohen not to retain 5 shkolim's worth, but to give it back to the father. Why? According to one opinion, the reason he gives it back to the father and doesn't retain it, even though it's consideration for selling back the son, the reason that the Kohen doesn't want to retain the money is because we don't know whether he's a real Kohen. Who is this Kohen doing the Pidyon Aben ceremony? He's a Suffolk Kohen. So if you think about it, if he keeps the money, according to one point of view, it's Suffolk Gezela. There's a Suffolk he hasn't stolen. He set himself up as a Kohen. He receives 5 shkolim for the purposes of redeeming the son. If he's a real Kohen, and he may be, who knows? We have to ask Eliyahu Hanavi if he's a real Kohen. Then he's entitled to keep the money. But he himself doesn't know if he's a real Kohen. He doesn't know what happened 400 years ago in his background. His father told him he was a Kohen, and his grandfather said he was a Kohen. But how does he know he's a real Kohen? He's a Suffolk Kohen. And therefore, he should really give the money back. If he's really being paid 5 shkolim worth in order to carry out that ceremony, he should really give that money back, because he's not necessarily a bona fide Kohen, according to one opinion. You see, we don't have these ways of recognizing the yichus of a person nowadays. Nowadays, we think of yichus in terms of whether the father is a rabbi of distinguished nature, or is a millionaire, or a hedge fund manager, or something like that. But yichus in the past was, do we know this is a real lady? Do we know this is a distinguished Israeli? Do we know that this is really a Kohen? And that can only come out of a search that's impossible for us to make. So let me just come back to the Gemara.
Eli, isn't there a reverse situation where someone who marries a divorced woman has to, in some sense, show that he's not a Kohen?
Show that he's not a Kohen. Yeah, that's right. Well, there is a reverse situation where they make an attempt to find, if you like, doubts to his Kohanic lineage. If you can save the marriage by finding doubts in the Kohanic lineage, yes. And that's precisely because there are those doubts. But yes, it's to his favor to prove he's not a Kohen under those circumstances. If you can find doubts, even though he may have had Kohanic aliyahs in the past, you see these things, they do. If they go back into the background and they found there was something wrong, I don't know, in the marriage, I don't know, he's a pagam, and you know, he was a mamzer or whatever it was, you wouldn't make a big announcement necessarily about it, not necessarily a mamzer, but some sort of doubt in his Kohanic lineage. And then you might be able to preserve the marriage. Yeah, but it's I don't know whether that's how much that's done in practice, but that is a kula that's used to salvage a marriage in certain circumstances where you can lay some doubt as to the Kohanic lineage of the individual. And then you can claim that he was a Israeli, and if he was Israeli, then he can marry a divorcee. Yeah, but it can be used a bit artificially, you know, to try and determine something you never really wanted to be proved a non-Cohen. But for this purpose, you suddenly go to great, you know, genealogical discoveries to prove you're a non-Cohen because it suits you. Okay. Right. You know, I think I'm going to stop the share now because the Gemara is going to start now on a alternative track, which will take us very much time simply to interpret it before it can be fully explained. And it's an alternative track to the Gemara that we've seen so far to explain the difference of opinion of whether you can blow the flute on a Shabbos or not, the original machlokus we came in. But at this point, if you like, where the Gemara has reached where we are now, is that it's quite possible to say Ika Shir B'Fer, but everyone agrees that it is the vocal music which is the one that is really mandated and not the instrumental. And that we had over here an expression of different historical perspectives on the flautists in the Beis Hamikdash, which had a difference in outcome as well in terms of what an observer would do if he saw one of these different types of groups up there. Would he consider this group to be of flautists to be of Yichus? Would he consider them to be Leviim, or might they even have been Avodim, with consequences on whether he would marry his daughter to them or whether he would make donations of Maisa to them. Okay, but we'll leave the rest for next week and recommence. It will be a good place to start. Just quit recording.